This is basic greenwood planing, how I typically do it. So I've got an example piece here of red oak. This is very green red oak. Obviously not spoon stock. This is more furniture kind of thing. But I've got it set up on my Roman workbench. And I'll show you really quickly. This is sort of a style of Roman workbench. It's just a half log with some peg legs. It's quite heavy. This is made out of pig nut hickory, so it's quite heavy. And then I've just got this grid of peg holes and various pegs here. And all you do is take a block and a wedge, and you can wedge stuff in. It's not perfect. It's not as good as a true joiner's bench, but for the things that I do, this is typically sufficient. And you can see I've already started to work on it a little bit here with the scrub plane, the Stanley number 40. So I'll just show you how this works. And this is just a rived piece of oak pulled out of the firewood stack. Nice green red oak, and it's fairly dense, which makes it a little easier to carve. And I don't know if I have this set quite aggressively enough. It's fairly aggressive. But as with a scrub plane, you run it across the grain rather than with the grain. Sometimes, and I go to diagonal a lot of times, depending on the piece I'm working. You can see how narrow this is. It only takes out, you know, a little trough like about that big. But you can see how quickly it hogs off wood. And this, I did dress a little bit with an axe to try to take some of the high spots out of it first, so it'll rest on the bench here a little bit easier. You can see over here I haven't done anything to it. And you see it's a little uneven. It wobbles a little bit. Sometimes it does that. Got a little gap under there. I can find a couple pieces of scrap and wedge. I'm still learning how to use this bench. I made it about a year ago, or well, actually maybe closer to 2 years ago. You can kind of wedge some stuff under there. Retighten our wedge here. Maybe that'll help a little bit. It's not wobbling so much. And this does have this bench itself. This is as much about the bench as it is about the planing, but you make these things green and you have to let them dry. And this has a hump in the middle, a very slight hump where it's drying. It's just the nature of drying wood. And this is so large, it's taken so long to dry that I haven't actually completed the finished surface yet. So it's getting close enough. At some point, I'll plane that hump out of the middle and hopefully it'll stay like it is. As you can see how rapidly I can work down the grain and just kind of eyeball. It's a little higher on this side, I think. So I might, rather than taking a full cut across the grain, I might try to focus on this edge a little bit. Starting to get flattened out a little. Starting to get nice, and I think it's a little higher on this side. This works really well for a very dumb, simple bench that it is. It's surprisingly effective. And I call it the Roman workbench because this is sort of reminiscent of the style that they've found in Roman mosaics at Herculaneum. I think it was on an episode of the Woodwright shop that they built one. And of course, They had a very, very finely made one with the double legs and all this stuff, but I just kind of decided to mimic one in a simpler, what you might call an Appalachian style. And I've seen other workbenches like this in museums around here. There's one over in Virginia at the Grayson Highlands State Park, I think, they've got a little museum about old-timey mountain life, and it had something similar to this, if I'm not mistaken. It wasn't exactly the same, but... So, alright, that's getting pretty well... That's getting nice and... That's nice and flat, and for certain things, you know, I wouldn't use this particular finish as a finish cut in this wood, because this is some really kind of chippy, terry red oak. If this was ash or birch or, you know, poplar or something like that, even white oak would be a little bit nicer to finish. So I'm going to try to go to my floor plane here, my wooden Thistle brand floor plane, mid-1800s. And as I mentioned in one of my other videos, it does have a cambered edge. And this is usually the progression I do for things like this. And it's so long, it'll take a second for you to find and get the high points off before you can get down into the low points. And it's often on the edge here, I find. I tend to work this one a little bit more diagonally. Starting to take off a little bit. Starting to flatten that out pretty nicely. So this plane could do with a little bit of an edge touch up. I only typically sharpen my planes once a year. I don't recall when the last time I sharpened this thing was, but I believe it's due. But it's still good enough. So, yeah. It's starting. You see one little tiny bit there. This is clearly not the kind of thing that a joiner would probably do, but okay. So that's taken. And that's the other part of the plane. This applies whether you're planing small pieces across the grain or whether you're doing, you know, with the grain work. When you plane, you want to act like pretend you're scooping ice cream rather than doing a banana motion, as it were. Pretend that blade is scooping ice cream. You really want to... And it's kind of hard to do that in narrow cross-grain pieces. A little bit harder. But again, we're not going for super fancy surface here. You can see the thickness of the shavings. They're wider than the scrub plane and a little bit thinner. But we do get this much more flat surface. And we'll go to this one just for the sake of demonstration purposes. This is my transitional sergeant here. And this one's cut with a much straighter, finer set bit or iron. Let's tighten that up a little bit. So the main problem why this is not staying tight like I want it is that it's got that hump in it, and that doesn't help matters because the piece is wobbling back and forth. So I think I should be able to get rid of that once I truly have the surface of this thing how I want it. A little slower with this one. And as you can see, it's still very capable of planing cross grain. diagonal on there, maybe. And while the nature of the wood is keeping this a little rough, and the fact that I'm still planing cross grain, you can see even finer shavings. So that is what I would consider acceptable if I was making a little peg leg chair. I would consider that acceptable until it dried. And then oftentimes I actually finish these with a spoke shave, planing with the grain, set the spoke shave really fine. And you can almost use it as a scraper to cut very paper thin shavings off, because a lot of these have curves in them and different things, and it's not really practical to use a smoothing plane. So I find that finishing these once they're dry with a spoke shave, specifically a Stanley number 51, the iron bodied planes, or spoke shaves rather, work really well for this. So check it for trueness. Yeah, as I expected, this little edge of sapwood here, that side is a little higher. Of course, you could flip it around and make it a little flatter. Work it till you have it like you want it. So, as a demonstration, that might be somewhat useful. You can see how fine. That's some really dense red oak. That stuff is crazy brash. I got a few good little turning blanks out of it, but nothing was big enough without knots that I could get any furniture pieces. So there you have it. That's what the grid pattern in the that is what the grid pattern in the bench looks like. You can see obviously the big check down here in the center. That doesn't matter. This is just a rough tool. And there are probably more grid holes here than I need, but it's come in handy doing different things. I've been able to hold bowls down. You can set things up to work with tall pieces like this too. So sometimes getting that adjusted can be a little bit of a trick, but there again, so you can work the edge down that way too. Hope this was maybe insightful in some way.